Fires, frustration, and a whole lot of frantic on-track action. The Supercars round in Melbourne supporting the Australian Grand Prix had just about everything. Despite having really short, sharp races, there is plenty to talk about both on and off the track, and that's exactly what we're doing today in my round 2 review for the 2023 Supercar season. By the way, this channel, Behind the Barrier, it only just started with the introduction of Gen 3 this year. I'm doing round previews, reviews, and lots of discussion videos in between each event, so if you love your supercars, please do subscribe. I'd love to have you support the channel. Okay, time for our race recaps, and because there were 4 races this past round, I'm going to keep things fairly high level. I will gloss over some of the detail, but we had a really interesting lead up to race 1. We had some really high intensity practice and qualifying sessions that saw a lot of incidents out there around the Albert Park circuit, but we got to race 1 and things were actually pretty darn tame. This is something we're perhaps seeing a bit of a trend emerge here. Same happened in Newcastle as well, and I do wonder if the teams are just very cautious about damaging their cars early on in the weekend. But sure enough, we still had a battle for the lead in the opening laps at least. Anton De Pasquale led the field away. Brody Kostecki was behind him and actually made a number of sort of half-hearted moves for the lead. He never really lunged properly, he just sort of positioned his car enough to make De Pasquale, stay away from the apexes. And unfortunately, that just really slowed them both down, and Shane Van Gisbergen caught up to them, past Brody Kostecki only about a third of the way through lap 1, I think it was, and then ultimately got De Pasquale only a few laps later. With the field spreading out reasonably quickly at this early point of the race, a lot of attention turned towards the strategy to hopefully mix things up, because the rules for the races this weekend meant that teams would have to run both the super soft and the hard tyre, and a lot of us were waiting in this opening race for that super soft to degrade. But we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and it just did not fade at all. So there was really no incentive for the teams to pit early and mix up the tyre strategy, because that super soft was just having a breeze of a time going around Albert Park, at least in those conditions, pretty much removing any incentive to do anything interesting with the strategy. That saw pretty much the whole field pit in the final couple of laps of the race, and then there was even a further confusion because the track had actually been declared wet, meaning while they still had to pit, they didn't even need to change over to the hard compound of tyres, which a couple of teams caught on to. So while everyone had their head buried in the Supercars operations manual trying to work out all those technicalities, the podium ceremony was held with Shane Van Gisbergen taking the win of the opening race that weekend, Brody Kostecki in second, and Will Brown, his Erebus teammate, in third. Fortunately for us, race 1 was pretty much the only dud of the weekend. The final 3 races were all incredibly exciting in my opinion. Race 2 did start off a little bit awkwardly on the Friday though, with the lights failing on the start grid. That meant that the officials actually resorted to a flag drop to get things going, and I've got to say, hats off to the officials for this one. It would have been so easy to resort to a safety car start under those conditions, but I loved the fact they went for the flag drop. It was a little bit old school. It sacrificed accuracy on judging the starts, but in my opinion, they prioritized entertainment, and I'm all here for that. The Erebus boys led the field away with a front row lockout, but they came under pretty much immediate pressure from the Red Bull duo. Shane Van Gisbergen and Brock Feeney piled on the pressure, and we saw some fantastic elbows out hard racing between the two teams, and that was pretty much the story the whole way down the field. There was so much going on. It was almost like it was NASCAR pack racing with some corners thrown in there for good measure. It was so exciting to watch, and for me, this was the first time under racing conditions I felt like Gen 3 started to deliver this year. It was so good to watch, and I really hope this was a sign of things to come. As I like to say though, it wasn't all sunshine and race cars. We saw a big fire from Nick Percat's Mustang earlier in the race, and the race did get cut really short as well, with Jack LeBrock putting it in the wall on the back section of the racetrack, but due to the scheduling and some delays earlier at the AGP, that race was going to be cut short regardless, which was very frustrating. But we saw Brody Kostecki take the win here, Shane Van Gisbergen in second, and Brock Feeney in third. Race 3 was just as intense. Erebus led the way, but Mark Winterbottom had a crash on the exit of turn 5 after tangling with, I believe it was James Golding. Frosty was very upset with how that one unfolded, but all attention was on James Courtney as his Mustang also caught fire in a very similar fashion to what we saw Nick Percat's do. So a lot of eyebrows were raised at this point, and that would have ramifications for race 4. When the race got going again though, we saw another big shunt at turn 5 between Macaulay Jones and Anton De Pasquale, doing a fair amount of damage to both of those vehicles as well. And then we had chaos in the pit lane, especially for the leading pack. We actually saw a pretty scary incident with Will Davidson collecting a wheel from Red Bull Racing. That wheel went rocketing down the pit lane, fortunately not hurting anybody, but it was just general chaos in that pit lane. We saw multiple unsafe releases, and unfortunately the race was cut a lap or two short, not as badly as the day before, but both Will Davidson and Bryce Fullwood, who was doing a great job at the front there, were both penalised off the podium, meaning the final result was Brodie Kostecki, Shane Van Gisbergen and Will Brown. Okay, the fourth and final race. Hopefully you're still with me. There's so much that went on this weekend. I feel like I've been recapping these races for ages now, but this final one got underway under safety car as a measure to help avoid some of those Mustang fires that we'd been seeing. That proved fruitful in addition to the mechanical quick fixes they did on those cars, because we saw no more fires in the final race. We saw a good race though. We had Mostert go around the outside of someone at turn 5, which was pretty darn impressive to watch. We saw he and Will Brown have a great fight towards the end of the lap as well. Ultimately, Will Brown got out on the marbles and spun the car around, and it didn't end that well for Mostert either, because his tyres went away towards the end of the race. That meant that the podium for the final race was Brock Feeney taking the win, followed by Andre Heimgardner in second, and Brodie Kostecki took the last step on the podium in third, but actually also won the round and the Larry Perkins Trophy. So I think it's fair to say a fair bit went down on this weekend of racing, which means it's a great time to revisit my predictions and see how I went. Now, I try to do predictions in every single one of my Supercars round previews. They're just a bit of fun, but I always like to swing back by and see how I went. And I was so close to the trifecta at the Melbourne round. I predicted at least 3 different winners. We got that. I predicted a bounce back from Dick Johnson Racing, which I believe we got compared to where they were at in Newcastle. The thing that caught me out though, I said I would only count this as a win for me if they got a podium. And that podium went begging, I think on 2 occasions, when De Pasquale got taken out in one of those races and Will Davidson got his post-race penalty as well for an unsafe release. So I was so close there. If I was a bit broader in my prediction and didn't qualify it as much as I did, I probably would have got the tick on that one. And I also predicted a big crash, or a crash at the very least, on the back section. We had multiple, but Shane Van Gisbergen definitely took care of that prediction with his massive moment on the back straight. And that brings us to the Carnage report. This is where I recap all the key damage taken over the course of the weekend, and it was on from pretty much the word go. In practice, we had Tim Slade put it in the wall pretty darn hard at turn 5, as many did this weekend. Shane Van Gisbergen, as I mentioned earlier, had a huge moment on the back straight, or the back curve if you will. He was very lucky not to take all 4 corners off that car. In race 2, we obviously had the huge fire from Nick Percat, which did a fair amount of damage, but they got it back on track, which was incredibly impressive the next day. Jack LeBrock also saw problems at the back section of the racetrack with a pretty hard hit on the left-hand side. And then, of course, as the weekend progressed, we saw an even bigger fire from James Courtney. That car couldn't be salvaged for any more racing, unfortunately. Mark Winterbottom, as I mentioned earlier, also took a big hit at turn 5. And then Jones and De Pasquale also saw issues with a 3-car incident at that same section of the racetrack. Let's take a look at the weekend wins, the key positives that I took away from this round of racing. And the first point for me, I really noticed a big improvement in the following and just general racing quality for these Gen 3 cars around Albert Park. I think the most promising moment I saw was when we were on board with a Red Bull, I think it was, looking back at one of the Nulon Camaros, and normally you used to see a huge gap appear around the back section of the racetrack from sort of turn 6 onwards as they had a huge amount of aero wash. That didn't happen. That Nulon Camaro was stuck to the back of the Red Bull, and we saw next to no aero issues with them following. So that was a huge plus in my opinion. I love that sort of pack racing we saw as well in race 2 or 3, I think it was. Really, really exciting stuff. It was a shame it was cut so short, but bodes well for the rest of the season. The second key positive for me is that we actually saw a lot of variety towards the pointy end of the field. Now, I feel the record books leaving this weekend are going to be a bit deceptive. There's sort of 3 names and 2 teams that are pretty much always there. But throughout the races, we had representatives from Dick Johnson Racing, we had drivers from Brad Jones Racing. We had a lot of people towards the pointy end that unfortunately got caught up in incidents or penalties, just really unlucky moments that otherwise would have had them either on the podium or really close to it. So despite what the books and records say, leaving this round, I think we actually saw a very competitive showing from a good chunk of the field. And finally, simple one, but an important one, the wheels didn't fall off. The wheel nut issue Supercars saw at Newcastle, which resulted in a lot of caution during the pit stops, seemed pretty much resolved with the many different solutions that are being explored by different teams. Whatever solution they landed on for Melbourne seems to have done the job. I don't think I saw any issues with cross-threaded wheel nuts or wheels not going on altogether. So looks like they've finally found a solution for those, which is great news for the rest of the season. What were some of the negatives out of this weekend though? It's not all positive. It is still early days for Gen 3, so there's going to be teething issues. And the first one I want to talk about is signs that there is genuinely some issues with the fragility of the Gen 3 cars. We had a crunch for James Courtney in Newcastle, which did a lot more damage than most people expected. I was hopeful that was just a bit of a freak scenario, but after the many incidents at the AGP, it seems like all the teams are a little bit concerned about how easily the cars are being broken or how severe the damage is from reasonably minor impacts. The second key talking point, I think, on the negative side out of this weekend was those 2 Ford Mustang fires for Nick Percat and James Courtney. Fire, obviously, driver's worst nightmare, but also for the teams as well, because it does so much damage as it did for those 2 vehicles. Fortunately, it seems like whatever the design flaw is there, it is reasonably solvable, because we did see a lot of quick fixes that seem to work for the Sunday race. But obviously, we don't want to have rolling starts all year long. We want to see them back on their standing starts. And I must admit, I was really surprised that it's taken to the AGP for this issue to emerge. Newcastle was almost double the temperature we'd seen in Melbourne this weekend, so I was really surprised this issue didn't rear its head sooner, but fingers crossed they get on top of it before Perth. And I'll link a video from Brad Jones Racing who explores his theory on what might have caused the fires in a bit more detail. And finally, there are serious questions about the future of supercars at the Australian Grand Prix, which brings us to the segment of the show that I call Clash Chat. This is normally where I take the biggest on-track incident from the weekend and pick it apart in a bit more detail, but today I want to focus on the clash between supercars and the Australian Grand Prix organisers. Now, these 2 organisations, they seem to get along really well, but I wanted to focus on the clash this weekend because it feels like the event has evolved a little bit and there's a few tensions emerging now between supercars and the Australian Grand Prix and what they can offer the series in terms of scheduling. So I think there were 3 key issues this weekend. Number 1, the introduction of Formula 2 and Formula 3 has compressed the schedule, given a lot more track time to other categories, so the supercars races were reduced in length. Now, for me, while I saw a lot of people upset about this one, I didn't think it was the end of the world. I certainly wouldn't want them any shorter than what they were designated to be, but I think it still worked. The second issue, and this is where I start to feel like there's some pretty serious discussions that need to take place, was time certainty. I was okay with the length of the races, providing they went the distance, and they rarely did this weekend. The races were cut incredibly short. We were a bit unlucky with a lot of incidents in F2 and F3 earlier on in some of the days. We had rain as well, which played a role. We had lots of crashes for supercars, but you do feel like some more wiggle room needs to be given in terms of time certainty. Obviously, supercars are the guests at this event. They are playing second fiddle to Formula 1, Formula 2, and Formula 3, all who have very strict TV scheduling around the world. So I understand why the circumstances played out as they did this weekend, but it does feel like a bit more thought needs to be taken on when the supercars races happen and some of their time certainty and wiggle room, just to make sure it's actually still enough for there to be value for the fans, the sponsors, and of course the drivers and teams themselves. And then there's some long-term headaches as well. It sounds like there's potential plans for Formula 2 and Formula 3 to take the pit garages that supercars currently occupy, meaning supercars might be relegated to temporary marquees use, or even if they built some sort of other garages for the teams to use, they still wouldn't have all their pit gear and stuff they need to make pit stops during the races. So certainly a lot of discussion to be had between the AGP and Supercars. You've got to wonder at what point do Supercars compromise so much that this event is no longer viable for them. But fingers crossed they find a solution, because I love seeing Supercars around this track. I think it's great for the sport that they get to share the international stage with Formula One. So I'm hopeful they have some positive discussions over the coming months and they get their future sorted soon. But that led me to ask you guys a big question with a YouTube poll this week. I wanted to know if you think it would be worth Melbourne dropping at least one of their support categories to guarantee a bit more or less issues with time certainty for the events that remain on the schedule. Now, 85% of you out of the 82 people who voted said yes, too many races were being cut short this weekend and that they should drop one of the support categories. 11% said no, I like the category variety even if it does cut some of the races short, and 4% were a little bit unsure. Now, I must admit, when I put this poll up, I was probably a little bit narrow-minded. Obviously, you don't have to cut a support category. That seems like the easy solution for me because it frees up the schedule for everyone else. But you could look at the time certainty, how early or late the events can start. Obviously, then you have to deal with local governments and noise restrictions and all that stuff. But yeah, it's not just topping support categories, there's potentially some other solutions as well. But the vast majority of people clearly want to see something changed from a Supercars perspective. So despite all those question marks leaving this weekend, my overall weekend rating I would say was 4 out of 5 stars. Now, I've tried to remove the time certainty issues from the equation here because I feel like that isn't something Supercars could control. That's down to the AGP. So I've tried to remove it from the equation. What we did see, in my opinion, was really encouraging. Race 1 was a little bit farcical with the tyre issues, but the other 3 events were fantastic in my opinion. It's been a really interesting start to Gen 3. I feel like in Newcastle, Supercars had the time because it's their event, they had long races, but the track didn't show the cars off in the best light. Melbourne was the opposite. They had the track that promoted good racing, but just not enough time for it to really unfold. So here's hoping that when they get to Perth, it's a Supercars event. It's a track that isn't fantastic for overtaking, but is still definitely better than Newcastle. Fingers crossed that's where we see it all come together and that it's third time lucky and we see a fantastic show. And the vast majority of you left the weekend feeling pretty positive as well, it would seem. 38% said they would rate this weekend 4 out of 5 stars, 10% went for the 5 stars, 31% went for 3 stars, and a few smaller percentages went for 1 and 2 stars out of 5. It should be said, a lot of people commented that they actually ducked a star off their rating due to the time certainty issues, so when you factor that in as well, I think the vast majority of fans, at least who view this channel, are feeling pretty good leaving the Melbourne round. Now let's start wrapping this show up. I always like to get some questions from you guys, and thank you again to everyone that did submit a question. First one here from Carl Hocking asking, would you have changed the format or left it as it was? Yeah, again, if you accept the fact Supercars are now going to have shorter races due to F2 and F3, which is the reality for the years ahead, I think the format is the best it can be. What I would like to see change is the durability of the Dunlop Super Soft. It sounds like Dunlop might be revisiting their tyres for the next season, especially as they get data on Gen 3. So fingers crossed that as part of that, they can make that Super Soft a little less durable as well. And hopefully we see some of that more strategic element come into the racing around Melbourne. Curry Pie asks, are the car fires a problem or was it just bad timing for 2 to happen on the same weekend? When I saw the fire for Nick Percat, I was really hopeful it was just a finger trouble putting the car together, or a freak failure that led to the blaze. But when we saw Courtney's car catch fire in a very similar fashion the very next day, it was clear there was a design issue. Again, I will leave the video from Brad Jones Racing in the description. He's got a theory. It's only a theory on what might have caused them, but it certainly looks like a design flaw. And finally, a comment here rather than a question, and actually one that was posted before the weekend even started. This one is from some bloke. That's his username, but I'm sure he is feeling a bit anonymous because he mentions the fact that the international viewers of Supercars couldn't catch anything from this weekend because of the TV rights. This is a really frustrating scenario where, because Supercars are at the AGP, they can't share it on their SuperView platform that allows international viewers to check in, and it doesn't sound like there's any real alternatives or legitimate alternatives for people to watch Supercars from outside Australia during this weekend. I wanted to bring this one up largely as a point of sympathy for anyone that is tuning in from outside of Australia or New Zealand. I really do get frustrated on your behalf about the situation. It's obviously a complicated one when it comes to TV contracts and stuff like that, but when Supercars was exhibition races at the AGP, I kind of get it, but it's a part of the Supercars Championship now, so in my opinion, they do need to sort something for the international viewers. Luckily for us, normal viewing service should resume from Perth, so let's take a look at the championship leaving Melbourne. Brody Kostecki, in terms of Drivers' Championship, is leading the way, followed closely by Chaz Mostert. Shane van Gisbergen is in third. Andre Heimgartner continues to quietly be right at the pointy end in fourth. Will Brown in fifth. Cam Waters in sixth. Brock Feeney in 7th, Reynolds in 8th, LeBrock in 9th, and Bryce Forward, who is putting on a pretty strong performance this year, is in 10th, and I suspect we're going to see him continue to climb that ladder. In terms of the Teams Championship, Erebus Motorsport continued to lead the way from Red Bull and Pole Racing. Brad Jones Racing is in 3rd, Walkinshaw Andretti United in 4th, and Penrite Racing in 5th. I think the key outliers to discuss here are Newlon Racing in 8th. They've had a lot of speed in their cars, but haven't really converted throughout the Melbourne weekend, and Shell V Power Racing. They had a horrible start in Newcastle, but showed some promise in Melbourne, so I expect them to also start climbing the leaderboard. And with that, that brings my Melbourne post-round review to a close. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do leave your thoughts down in the comments below. Remember that I do share my personal opinion a lot in these videos. You're welcome to disagree, but please do treat myself and other people like your trackside down there in the comments. Attention now turns towards Perth, my home round. I'm really looking forward to seeing the Gen 3 cars in person. We do have a few weeks to wait though, so I'm going to bring you guys some filler videos to sort of tie you over to round 3 of the championship. So please do subscribe if you want to see more of that stuff. Please do like and comment on anything you see from me. It helps the channel grow and also increases the chances you will see stuff from me on YouTube moving forward. So big thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next video.